Given the evolution of pretrial services and the economic climate, what are your thoughts on the role of pretrial services in the criminal justice system today? And I'd add, in your opinion, has that role changed significantly over the decades, and has it changed specifically with regard to the economy? And I think that we will turn this, because we're having some trouble getting our audio participation from Barb Darby, and we're really, really sorry about that, and we're continuing to work on it. If possible, Spurgeon Kennedy, if you're on the line, Kenny, can you field this question for us?
Sure. First off, again, good morning. Good afternoon. I'm on the East Coast, everyone listening. As I look at this question, it strikes me that as pretrial programs have evolved over the years, they've mirrored the evolution in national bail law, both the federal bail law and also state and local bail laws. Most bail statutes now include a presumption of non-financial release, as well as the idea of supervised pretrial release. Even though we see the continued use of money bail, most bail statutes actually rank money as a last resort for persons who can't be released safely on non-financial conditions. We know that from research that this is a clear minority of pretrial defendants. All the latest research seems to indicate that. So many statutes also outline statutory detention based on that defendant's potential risk to public safety. With these changes, we still see money bail being used as a preferred method of keeping people in jail. And I believe the proper role, if you look at all this in pretrial programs, is to encourage their justice systems to imply and enforce the existing bail laws by making non-financial release an attractive and practical first option for appropriate defendants. Step one in this is defining or redefining through that agency's mission and goals a commitment to maximize release for appropriate defendant populations. And step two, I think, is learning about and adopting the evidence-based practices that are appropriate to the pretrial field, such as risk assessment, graduated and targeted supervision, performance measurement, and also engaging the support of the natural community-based and criminal justice allies that we have out there.
Kenny, as we get ready for Dan to join in and answer this question, let me ask you a quick follow-up question, if I may.
Sure.
What is wrong with having communities increase the use of financial bond? What are the risks of relying on a tradition that this country has used for over 200 years in determining who gets released pending trial and who is held in detention?
Well, I'll give you two, and they're probably the most obvious ones for people who are practicing in the field. First off, money doesn't protect the community, as we've known. There really isn't a magic remark or a magic bail amount that I can set on a defendant thinking that he or she will be released and get that release secured, or thinking that they'll be detained and detention will happen. One of the favorite terms I've heard recently by some program managers is the oops bail, where a judge will set a bond amount fully thinking that a defendant will either meet it or not meet it and have the exact reverse happen. So relying on money as a means of balancing a defendant's right to release and the public's expectation for safety just doesn't work. Second, I think more appropriately, it simply isn't the most equitable way of determining bail. We have other methods that are better, shown by research, and also more respective of due process that would allow a defendant to secure release into the community and at the same time managing the risk that that defendant presents. According to every bail law that is out there, that's the optimum, and it seems as if non-financial release gets us to that optimum much better than financial bail.
Thanks. Dan, as we hand this question over to you, Kenny's just explained that our reliance or over-reliance on financial bond essentially gives us jails full of people who cannot make that bond rather than jails full of people that need to be there to protect our communities and to maintain the integrity of our judicial process. You've done an awful lot of work with evidence-based practice and have administered programs that have touched virtually every innovation that has evolved over the last several decades. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Responding from the second most impoverished city in America, that being Cleveland, the economic situations have had all the impacts that you had discussed, Tim, and of course Kenny. With jail overcrowding, increased pretrial detention, where a valuable sentencing option for the courts then is not available to them because of all the pretrial detention in the county jails. Of course, there's the staffing challenges for pretrial services to even fulfill their traditional roles, which are of course the neutral information provider of verified information to the courts to make bond and release decisions. And of course, as things have evolved in the field, the pretrial services have obviously begun to look at how they can interact with the larger criminal justice systems in the community by identifying special populations, mentally ill, substance abusers, that we can provide services to, whether incarcerated or release plans to get them to the community while they're in the pretrial piece, and then on to post-dispositional if that's what occurs. And of course working with specialized dockets, whether those are drug courts, mental health dockets, any of those types that exist, in providing referrals and supervision opportunities for those. I think that all of these challenges, Tim, create those situations where evidence-based practices is the only place I can see that's going to allow us to embrace what's happening in the post-disposition world and be able to marshal our resources and use them the most effectively to get the results we want, which is ultimately that in pretrial that there is a reduction in pretrial arrests and, of course, an increase in appearances. We all have to learn how to work smarter and better and marshal our resources, and I think what we have learned from the post-dispositional world of evidence-based practices lends us that formula.
Thank you both for that. Those of you in our audience who know Barb Darby, as both Kenny and Dan do, and as well as I, know that we can almost hear Barb shouting out her answers, but her audio still is non-functional, and it looks like it is likely to remain so. We will, however, make Barb's thoughts and answers available after the broadcast of this webinar in a format that can be easily accessed by our listeners. Barb is an important part of trial justice nationally, and we miss her in this conversation. Let's go ahead and go on to the next question, if we can. And Dan, I'm going to pick on you again and ask you this question first, followed by asking Kenny the same question. So we know that pretrial services play a critical role. We've talked about the impact the economy is having not only on our local governments, but also on our client base, as home ownership has been severely impacted with declining employment rates and the obvious fragility of a system that's based on dollars equated to pretrial release. So we know that our programs, our systems need us. What are some of the critical elements, however, for pretrial service agencies to become evidence-based? They did not start as evidence-based initiatives. They started as reform initiatives or initiatives designed to alleviate jail crowding. How do they cross that bridge, Dan?
I think there's a two-front effort that needs to be done, Tim, and there's the overall system embrace that needs to occur that evidence-based practices make sense in the pretrial role. And that, of course, challenges the premise that Kenny and you both spoke to earlier in our discussion, which is that we have to challenge the premise that an individual charge that results in a set financial bond amount speaks to either public safety or court appearance of that defendant. It does neither, and there is nothing in the evidence-based practice literature that would support that type of premise, even though that premise exists across our country in the bond setting role for courts currently. At the individual program level, basically, I think that the programs need to learn what we have learned in the post-dispositional world this last 10 years, that the implementation of evidence-based practices is thoughtful. It's going to end up with the best results of what our challenges are regarding public safety, of doing recidivism reduction, and of course what our role is in pretrial. Just literally in the last day or so, the Justice Policy Institute released a publication June of 2010 for immediate release, and it's titled "How to Safely Reduce Prison Populations and Support People Returning to Their Communities." The strategies that it suggests, I think, as it relates to prisons and parolees, you could literally use those same strategies to do jail reductions and bringing defendants back to the community. So the individual programs are challenged to educate their judges and their criminal justice fellow system players that the evidence-based practices that are being supported and being learned in the post-dispositional world have an application in pretrial. There are legal concerns we have to be mindful of, assumption of innocence and those in your legal rights, but there is a role for these, and we need to get these into place as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Dan. Kenny, as I lob the ball over to your side of the court, let me add that this would appear to be a time of golden opportunity for those that are devoted to pretrial justice reform. We have an economy that would seemingly support the cost efficiencies of such a reform. We have a public that, when polled, seems to answer in a very strident and unmistakable way that they support alternatives to incarceration for those who do not pose a danger to the community or an inordinate danger of flight. You have Congress talking out loud about this stuff. You have groups as diverse as the chiefs of police and the American Bar Association and the Association of Counties, who would all seem to be a perfect storm gathering to help pretrial services programs take this step into evidence-based practice and into lasting legitimacy, my word, as far as the contribution they make to their local justice system and to their local communities. I ask you the same question that Dan just fielded. What, however, do programs have to do? What critical elements are needed for these agencies to, in fact, become evidence-based rather than simply claim the banner of supporting evidence-based practice?
Yeah. I think first, we've got to decide which of those evidence-based practices apply to our field and to what degree. At the moment, I think that risk assessment probably is the most acceptable of the principles that we have out there, and thanks to the work of people like Dr. Van Nostrum and others, we do have a lot of science behind the idea of risk assessment, being able to rank order defendants properly and to the risk of failure to appear in rearrest that they might pose. Targeted interventions fit very nicely in what the field has been yelling the last 40 or 50 years or so, and that is you really shouldn't put conditions on defendants or anyone else that really don't apply to risk. You shouldn't over-condition the people under your supervision. That was a central part of the NAPSA standards developed in the late 1970s, and a lot of the performance and evaluation data that's coming out right now. However, things such as enhancing intrinsic motivation kind of raise questions, at least to me, about the proper role of pretrial programs. Are we here to change behavior, or are we simply controlling very short-term the things that defendants are doing while they're out on pretrial release? can we practically accomplish that kind of behavioral change given the short window of time that we have most defendants under supervision? So we really have to decide which of the evidence-based practices are the ones that we want to be a part of. The most critical element, I think, in making this decision is information, knowing what we want to pursue, sharing what we've learned in the field, identifying the lessons that we've learned from other areas, especially the behavioral sciences. And you mentioned before, Barb is out there screaming somewhere, don't forget performance measurement, don't forget outcome measurement. We have got to get better at determining what it is we want to measure, how we want to measure it, and giving that information to our criminal justice partners and the people who support us. That means moving beyond the rubric of failure to appear in rearrest being the only thing that we report out. We should be able to report how many of the people that we put out in the community stay safely in the community. How often do we as a supervising agency respond correctly to infractions that the defendants will have with conditions of court-ordered release. So figuring out what those practices are that really apply to us and figuring out how to measure them, I think, are really the first critical steps needed to become evidence-based.
Thanks, Dan. As you take this question, Kenny suggests that we take a candid and forthright approach with regard to the purpose, meaning, and outcomes of our work. It's pretty hard, however, to resist that temptation of portraying ourselves as being able to do all things for all people. If, as Kenny suggests, we focus on our actual mandate, our actual job, rather than what we think the rest of the system wants from us, what are some of the critical elements you think are needed for pretrial services programs and agencies to, in fact, become evidence-based?
Well, I would agree with Kenny that as Marie Van Nostrum challenged the pretrial field to look at our underpinning legal principles and then how we embrace evidence-based practice, we always have to be mindful of that. There is an assumption of innocence. There is the shorter supervision period that Kenny spoke to, that we should not be over supervising individuals. All of those things are important. I mean, to begin with, I would totally agree with Kenny that what's most accepted in the field now, but is not in full implementation, is the beginning of using a validated risk instrument, that we're making decisions based truly on the risk of individuals reoffending under the pretrial supervision or failing to appear in court. In Ohio, we've been lucky. We've been working with the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and the University of Cincinnati, Ed Latessa and company, to create a statewide risk instrument that would be used for pretrial services. We're in the piloting implementation stage right now. I think the use of that forces the pretrial service agencies then to be mindful of not doing targeted interventions at supervision that we have done in the past, and my shop has been as guilty of this as others, is over-supervising people, having one or two supervision response that all folks are supposed to fit under, whether that's urinalysis or electronic monitoring or reporting on a specific schedule to your supervision officer. By putting individuals into categories of low and medium and high risk, it forces us to come up with responses that are individually assessed to that defendant's risk elements and what their needs are. And I think those are the two elements that we are most accepting in the field, and we still need to formalize the process of utilizing validated risk instruments and then the response to those. And I would totally concur with what Kenny also said. I know Barb's out there frustrated because I think Barb speaks very well to the issue that the individual programs need to make sure that their internal infrastructure supports that they can gather information, react to information, and share information with other criminal justice players that speaks to those roles.
Absolutely right, Dan. In preparation for this webinar, we've had many conference calls with Barb. She always makes such a compelling case that collecting data is not even half the job. Being able to understand what the data mean, and then fulfilling your obligation to take those findings and share them with the rest of the system. And Barb will be the first to admit that her program for many years was very good at collecting data and then not being able to do much with it, and how much more of a challenge it was for her as the program administrator to be able to take the findings associated with the data they collected and to report that back to the rest of the justice system. One of the huge advantages above and beyond transparency in doing so is that it also creates the expectation within the system that you will continue to report your outcomes. And as you do so, the rest of the system becomes further and further invested in your work. I'm going to drive the webinar organizers and the panelists crazy and invoke moderator prerogative and ask a quick question as a follow-up to this current question of both Dan and Kenny. Kenny first. Both of you have talked about using some kind of scientific way to assess risk rather than the traditional subjective assessment that's still being used by many programs across the country. So I'd like to ask you each, what's wrong with using my subjective judgment? I'm the typical pretrial services agent. I've been on the job for 9 years. I know the population that gets arrested. I've developed good, sound instincts regarding who is likely to appear and who is likely to get in trouble. Kenny, I'll start with you. Why shouldn't the system look to me and my intuition above some kind of actuarial table to guide the decisions that I make on a day-in, day-out basis, or that my coworkers make on a day-in, day-out basis?
It's a great question, Tim. If the choice is between nothing at all and my subjective judgment, by all means, be as subjective as you can. That at least gets us something that is consistent when it comes to making recommendations. Unfortunately, if you look at what the behavioral sciences have shown over the years in looking at those actuarial risk assessments and comparing them to the subjective judgments, the clinical assessments of people, what they have found is that the actuarial assessments are far superior than even the best guesses and best judgments of professionals in the field. If you have a tool that has been demonstrably shown to be better, it makes sense to use it. The other big issue here, and this is one that I've pointed out to pretrial program managers and staffs across the country, is my best judgment as a pretrial case manager may not be your best judgment as a pretrial case manager. And if there are more than one person doing that particular diagnostic assessment of that defendant, you may get two very different opinions about release, detention, about the types of releases or conditions that are needed. I think for consistency's sake, to show that this is a pretrial services agency's risk recommendation and not some professional's viewpoint, you need that scheme to make things consistent in your agency itself. Again, the actuarial assessments, as flawed as they can be sometimes, are still better than best judgments, and I think they ought to be used that way.
Dan, as we throw the question to you, let me add one confounder to it. We've all worked with judges. We all know that judges possess unique and distinct personalities. It is not unusual that some judges have what appears to be a bias against certain types of crimes and certain types of public misbehavior. Dan, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I lost the very end of the question, but I got most of it.
Are you still there? I'm having a little static on my phone.
Yes, I am.
Okay, good. Dan, what about the judge that we know doesn't like car theft and we have a car theft case, and the actuarial table says that this guy's a good risk. You know you're going to get your head chopped off in open court, or if you recommend that. Aren't we better off letting you use your subjective judgment, letting you use your personality to try and cajole and convince decision makers to do the right thing?
I think that what historically has happened in those situations, and thanks for this question, Kim, is that what happens is that the pretrial staff begins to mirror the decision maker / judges' biases, and so those individuals are not released. Obviously, there's some skilled staff and some staff that are willing to work on the edge a little more than others that will challenge that. I think what the validated risk instrument does is give a tool for all the pretrial staff to enter in that conversation with that decision maker judge, that this individual by this validated risk instrument is a low risk individual, judge, even though the offense that occurred is one of the ones that you typically don't like. I think we can come up with a response, a supervision response based upon this individual's specific risk issues that will allow us to safely supervise this individual on a ROR release. It's not always going to be accepted by the judge, but I think it gives the staff a lot more ammunition to enter into that conversation. Judges, obviously, besides the work they do in arraignment rooms and at the pretrial thing, also work, those same judges work in the post-dispositional world. There is a lot of exposure for the judges now about what evidence-based practice means in the post-dispositional world and how probation departments are supposed to marshal their resources to use evidence-based practices and how the judges have to be in concert with that. We just need to broaden this conversation that says that there is an application for this also in that pretrial decision-making. I have judges currently in Cleveland that are very comfortable in the implementation and utilization of evidence-based practice in sentencing decisions that they're gathering this information from the pre-sentence report. We need to carry that forward into saying it's the same type of principles that we're asking you to review and consider at the release decision.
Thanks. I know I'm working you guys really hard without Barb here to help us, and I really appreciate you guys carrying this load.
Yeah, we were supposed to respond to Barb. No.
And I know that were Barb here, she would talk to us about how this information then creates a loop as you feed back outcomes to decision makers. That feedback becomes crucially important when we talk about validated risk assessment. When we talk about, as Kenny mentioned, the purpose of bail rather than the purpose of rehabilitation or fixing people that some might ascribe to these programs. When we talk about, as Dan mentioned, the supervision of the individual, again, designed to ensure appearance in court and law abiding, not designed to achieve the objectives and goals that are the mandate of other components of the justice system, such as probation or parole. We have a relationship with our defendants for a relatively short period of time. Our opportunity is to ensure the safe release of individuals who can be counted upon to reasonably stand a chance of appearing in court and to stay out of trouble pending trial. The CJI, the Crime and Justice Institute, has recently published a roadmap for evidence-based practice in pretrial services. It's really a very nice piece of work, and I know that we will have specific information for our audience on how to access the Virginia Roadmap for Pretrial Services Evidence-Based Practice during this webinar and as part of our post-webinar communication. We do have one more question for our panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for their input and for their comments, criticisms, and their questions as well. So here comes your welcome last question, gentlemen. What are some of the challenges for pretrial agencies and how have you overcome them? And rather than with challenges large across the wall, if we can, let's confine this conversation to the challenges associated moving from what systems probably expect from us in a traditional vein to assuming an evidence-based platform for our policies and our practices. And Kenny, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to start with you.
Oh, surely. I really see this as almost a SWOT analysis, a strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat analysis, not only just for individual pretrial programs, but also for the field. And Tim, I think you're right. The economy that we find ourselves in poses both perhaps the greatest challenge and maybe the most welcome opportunity to do this. In looking at this whole thing, we have to ask ourselves, what are the strengths that pretrial programs bring, and what are the weaknesses as well? You know, where are the opportunities to advance and grow, and where are the threats going to come from? The biggest continuing threat that we have, both individually and collectively as a field, continues to be the culture of cash. The idea to many judicial officers in bail setting that you have to impose a money bond on a defendant, and we've seen the outcome of that in both the data that the Bureau of Justice Statistics puts out about jail crowding, and just the rate of pretrial detention as it increases nationwide. It's also egged on, unfortunately, by us practitioners, by a well-funded commercial bail bonding industry. We're unique. We happen to have a bunch of private industry folks out there who would love to put every pretrial program out of business if they could. They see the court's use of money bond, and they certainly encourage it. We have to look at the economic downturn that we have now as an opportunity to show jurisdictions that detention is costly. They already know that. But pretrial programs with a strong risk assessment, risk validation, risk management system in place can be a better option for pretrial defendants other than jail. It's a cost saver. It helps you apply your bail law the way that it should be applied, and it makes sense. It just makes sense given the resources that most jurisdictions don't have. The real weakness here, and we've said it before, is just a lack of information that many agencies have about effective practices in these areas, and the fallacies of the arguments that bondsmen are putting out about pretrial programs and their own successes. We are so busy putting out those kinds of fires that we're not able to show our jurisdictions how good we can be, as programs. So better information dissemination to help jurisdictions learn about the advantages of non-financial release and the true fiscal system and human cost of money bond have to be a priority for the leaders in the pretrial field. Another huge strength that we have, that I believe that we have and we're beginning to tap into, is the desire within the justice system for evidence-based practices that work. Judges hear this all the time. Prosecutors hear it. Policymakers hear it. This whole idea of there are evidence-based practices out there that if they are only applied will help your system not only work better but save resources. Everyone seems to be on the evidence-based practice bandwagon, and they want examples of practical and cost-saving interventions. I think the research shows very clearly that we have those kinds of interventions on the pretrial side, especially when it comes to risk assessment and targeted interventions. And we have to start putting those out there and getting the information and the word out to our partner agencies that can help us, advance this whole effort. I think the serious challenge there is how to take what we've already know about pretrial services and make it known to the rest of the criminal justice system and also to policymakers nationwide.
Thanks, Kenny. Dan, your thoughts on challenges and how we can overcome them?
I would obviously just mirror some of what Kenny's remarks were. I think there's the overall field challenge that Kenny alluded to, which is the challenge of a system that still embraces cash and surety bonds to the degree it does. I mean, we need to do a large piece of education with the media, so that there isn't screaming headlines that our judges fear of low bond or an ROR release that got arrested on a new charge, and then the whole system is damned. But you don't see those similar headlines typically for individuals that the oops releases that Kenny alluded to, where the risk of the individual was quite extensive, and the individual made a high surety bond and then doesn't appear or reoffends in that. But the judges run in fear of those media headlines, and so the field needs to do an education piece regarding that, regarding the fact that there's nothing in financial decision-making that would be supported by the utilization of evidence-based practice. I think for the pretrial services programs, I think that the challenge there is that the size doesn't matter. This is not a response just for large programs, large urban programs. This is a logical response for one person pretrial service agencies that exist, very small ones in rural areas. This is the way that the overall field, criminal justice field, is going. You need to not immunize yourself from its application because we're small, we're here out in the rural area. This doesn't apply. Also, of course, not allow yourself to have the system niche you into a certain area where pretrial services is fine on low-level felony offenders, people with no previous history, those type of things. As Kenny has said, the bail laws across the country at the state level support, release, supervised release, and financial is the third last option, almost uniformly across the country. And so the pretrial service agencies needs to advocate that by using validated risk instruments, they shouldn't be niched into a certain type of offense or a certain type of defendant.
Thank you both. And I know you join me in reminding our audience that's listening in from literally across the country that you're not alone in this work. In addition to organizations such as CJI that has organized and orchestrated this webinar, we also have groups such as the National Institute of Corrections that offer cost-free training for pretrial executives. It's week-long training that really is top-notch stuff that helps program administrators and executives make this move from traditional criminal justice practice to evidence-based pretrial program administration. There's the National Association of Pretrial Services Agencies, an organization that all three of us have been active in for quite some time, and that I encourage all of our listeners, if they're not involved with, to look at NAPSA, the National Association of Pretrial Services Agencies, as a wonderful ally. We have the federal pretrial services programs in the U.S. courts that are really doing wonderful work with regard to validated risk schemes and supervision. Reach out and connect with your federal counterparts among our listening audience. And then we have the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the largest criminal justice grant maker in the country, that is now paying very close attention to pretrial justice issues and challenges and is making grant opportunities available to support same. They also support technical assistance, as does the National Institute of Corrections, for local practitioners that are interested in upgrading, refining, and making evidence-based their pretrial justice practices. Now we want to take some questions from our audience. We've been collecting your questions as we've been babbling on here, talking about all the things that are so important to us and important to you. If I may, Ellen, let's bring Ellen back on the line and ask her to go ahead and share our first question with us. Ellen, are you there?
Thank you, Tim. What a great conversation. We have another poll for our audience.